Okay, so in the original recording of this, I accidentally call the article "In Defense of Marxism" for some reason, but it's "In Defense of Universalism" is what the paper is actually called. So I apologize for that embarrassing slip of the tongue. I've been reading too much Leon Trotsky material.
Hey everybody, this is a piece titled In Defense of Marxism by Alison Assiter. Here we go. In 2003, in a book entitled Revisiting Universalism, I stressed the importance in political theory, and in politics more generally, of a universalizing perspective, a view that suggests that there are political and moral imperatives deriving from the fact of our universal humanity. In the present day, this universalizing outlook is, if anything, all the more pressing and important. A quote, universal outlook counters the multiculturalist or pluralist perspectives that have flourished in leftist political circles in the West for many years. In this chapter, I should like to stress once more how important this perspective is. For many years, I have suggested that universalism is better defended in terms of a theory of common human natural nature than in terms of the most frequently upheld alternative. This alternative holds that universalism amounts to a belief in human rights. While I believe that human rights are vitally important in a world where, increasingly, this kind of secularism is being challenged, it is clear that it is a perspective that is not without its problems and its detractors. Indeed, it is often this form of universalism that is identified with universalism per se and criticized by the opponents of the position. In this paper, I will offer an alternative to this form of universalism in terms of a version of naturalism. Rather than attempting, however, as I have done before, to spell out necessary and sufficient conditions for a human natural nature, I will offer a different kind of account. The conception of common human nature has itself come in for criticism from two different quarters. First, it is said that it is trivial, and second, some have claimed that it is likely to be reductive. On the first point, Norman Garris argues, quote, you point out, that there are certainly transhistorical human needs and capacities. You get the reply, oh well, if that's what you mean by human nature, end quote, Norman Garris. Second, however, it is argued that it reduces humans to a set of animal needs. I will offer a response to both these criticisms. So this paper falls into two distinct parts. First, I will attempt briefly to respond, once again, to some of the common criticisms of universalism. But second, I would like, drawing upon the work of Søren Kierkegaard, whose writings I have been exploring recently, to explore a dimension of common human nature that is different from the positions I have defended before, and that calls in its turn for a shared set of goals on the part of all of humanity. This dimension of human nature will involve me in expressing a challenge to the, quote, enlightenment self that underlies both the critiques of universalism upheld by some postmodernists and certain conceptions of universalism itself. I will suggest that a different model of this self is less likely to give rise to the criticisms. The version I will present, I believe, expresses a more plausible and convincing form of universalism. New section. Some common criticisms of universalism and some responses. Critics of universalism have made significant interventions and deep criticisms of any form of universalism. Gilroy wrote, quote, incredulous voices have drawn attention to the bold, universalist claims of Occidental modernity and its hubristic confidence in its own infallibility, end quote. Gilroy. I'm assuming that's Paul Gilroy. Human universality has been seen as an Enlightenment conceit. Human universality has been viewed as inevitably presupposing the imposition of purportedly and falsely, quote, universal values on those falling outside the invariably European and white norm. Such a critique of universalism, however, might indicate that the, quote, universal outlook against which the comment inveighs was not genuinely universal. On another note, though, the claim that it is Eurocentric to defend a universalism of this kind is open to contestation. Gita Sagal, for one, has forcefully challenged the view that a secular universalist human rights perspective stems exclusively from European values and a European context. Indeed, she has argued that the movement in India that challenged the twin ills of colonialism and fundamentalist Hinduism was, and still is, the universalizing discourse of human rights. Some, quote, liberal political thinkers watered down a universalist perspective to defend communitarianism or multiculturalism. In its communitarian version, liberal pluralists suggested that a community or a society is important for a moral theory to have practical force. Walzer, for example, claimed that it is vital that we stay rooted in our communities in order to make sense of our shared ethical values. Many in Western liberal democracies responsible for the policy enactment of views like this developed policies that prioritize the significant and important values of communities. Of course, communities are important. There is no reason, however, for universalists to deny this claim. One problematic version of communitarianism, however, is when, quote, community values, like, for example, reactionary and extreme views about gay people or about women, are allowed to reign unchecked within certain, quote, communities. It was fascinating for me to hear recently a Muslim woman from the Sudan, who now lives in the UK, say how shocked she was at the right-wing and misogynistic version of Islam held within some Muslim communities in the UK. These values have been allowed to flourish at least partly because of a belief on the part of many in the UK in multiculturalist and, quote, community forms of pluralism. In the desire not to fall foul of the supposed Enlightenment conceit, well-meaning non-universalist white liberals may have inadvertently allowed pernicious and right-wing values to take root in some of the multicultural communities they argued should be tolerated. It is difficult for me, as I have written before, as a white Western woman, to express points like these, for there is a real risk of them becoming racist. It is important to guard carefully against this. However, it is also vital that women like me are not prevented from speaking in favor of universalism because of a risk of it becoming identified with Eurocentrism or racism. It is a universalizing perspective that allows us to recognize that crimes against humanity have been committed by Eastern powers, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, as well as by Western states like the United States. One lesser-known such crime is the collusion of the Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh in the genocide committed by the Pakistani army against secular nationalist and religious minorities in 1971. Indeed, it may be the denial of the possibility of a universalizing perspective that leads some in the West to castigate a racist white people who set out to critique such practices. Postmodernists famously argue that the purported universal qualities of humans, proclaimed by many broadly Enlightenment thinkers, were not universal at all, and involved generalizing from features of the self that were true only of certain groups, usually white, middle-class, powerful men. This is a very important point. Any features claimed to be universally true of humans must be genuinely universal. New section. Why universalism is important at the present time. In 2003, I argued that one central reason why it is important to defend a universalist theory about human rights was to characterize the shared humanity of, for example, the poorest person in the world and the richest person. In figures from the United Nations Development Program from 1998, quote, the assets of the 3 richest people in the world were more than the combined gross national product of the 48 least developed countries, comprising 600 million people, end quote. These figures themselves are enough to give any of us pause for thought. Today, though, the gap is wider and even starker. The present Ebola outbreak illustrates, indeed, the kinds of threat posed, even to the richest in the world, by these damaging levels of inequality. Unless the two groups recognize their shared humanity, then the poorest are liable to be written off as either implicitly not human at all or as possessing some inferior form of humanity. Extreme levels of inequality, anyway, as many economists have argued, are detrimental to the well-being of all. One can make parallel kinds of points, though, about other areas of difference between groups of people. Is it not wonderful when Israelis recognize their shared humanities with Is it not wonderful when Israelis recognize their shared humanity with Palestinians? when far right-wing individuals see that they share something with those on the left, and when fundamentalists see what they share with those whom they oppose. Of course, even these claims involve what might seem a paradoxical challenge to universalism. If some groups themselves challenge universalism, then how can a universalist outlook be applied to them? How can I claim an attachment to universalism on the part of the very groupings that set out to challenge the notion? This, however, is exactly what they need to do if humanity overall is not to destroy itself through numerous processes of, quote, othering particular sections of humanity on the part of some, fundamentalists seeking to destroy non-fundamentalists, Western powers seeking to destroy, quote, Eastern jihadists, whites seeking to differentiate themselves from black people, and the rich seeking to doubt or deny the existence of the poor. It is only possible to make these claims if there is something shared by all, and if there is additionally something on the basis of which all can act in the name of a shared humanity. Moreover, and equally important, there is something all humans share with the non-human natural world. Each group of us, whether we are European or Middle Eastern, rich or poor, religious or atheist, stands in a relation to a non-human nature that is itself deserving of recognition as morally significant in some form. We must also note, and this is all the more pressing as at the present time, the reality of the biological human body, with its needs for food, water, shelter, and the further need of humanity as a whole to reproduce itself. Some notion of sex difference between humans is I never remember how to pronounce this person's name. Kierkegaard has argued, foundational to humanity and constitutes an ontological reality that is of a different order from differences of sexual orientation, class, or race. It is even the case that Elizabeth Gross has pointed out, against those who contest the foundational point about biological sex, such as Drusilla Cornell or Judith Butler, that many transsexual people were originally biologically male or female. These biological realities exercise causal force over the human as a cultural and social being. This is not at all, of course, to suggest that humans consist wholly and exclusively of such qualities, but rather that these qualities are foundational to the possibility of other aspects of the human. This is not, again, is Kierkegaard has argued, to claim that, for some people, at certain points in their histories, the experience of racial or class oppression or oppression deriving from sexual orientation may feel primary. It may also, at that moment in cultural and social history, actually be primary for them. Biological sex, as I will argue in a moment, is significant for a different reason, and it need not undermine this important point. Some criticisms of universalism, then, are grounded in a view of the self that challenges these biological realities. They stem in part from a view of the, quote, universal self that is derived from Descartes and Locke, and particularly also from Kant. The Lockean and Kantian self is one that forms a kind of autonomous substance with essential properties. These essential properties include such abstract and general qualities as the possession of a mind or consciousness. These characteristics, in other words, are thought to define one's identity and to give one one's essential nature. One's biological and natural self, on the other hand, for these thinkers, forms a kind of mechanical entity governed by Newtonian laws of motion. Standard forms of universalism, then, derive from one or the other aspect of this view of the self. One form of universalism depends upon a view that universal reason categorically differentiates humans from other animals. Humans are then accorded rights on the basis of this universal reason. Critics then claim that these rights are not genuinely universal. Another form of universalism has human beings defined in terms of a reductive and mechanical, quote, animal, nature that fails, according to the critics, to recognize our, quote, true humanity. New section. An alternative conception of universalism and naturalism. I would like, in the rest of the paper, to present an alternative conception of the human self and of universalism. I will offer a view of nature overall and of human nature in particular that I derive from Kierkegaard. The view I am offering here has some similarities with the view of the natural self, that is Darwinian, but that is also akin to some of the metaphysical assumptions of Bergson, Derrida, and Deleuze. I read these thinkers, however, along similar lines to those defended by Gross. I will seek to defend a form of naturalism that sees each self as in a process of becoming, as undergoing change and development, and yet as sustaining an identity throughout this process. This theory, then, will offer a contrast both to the, quote, human rights form of universalism, as well as to what has been conceived as a reductive naturalist form of universalism. Kierkegaard, in my view, while he does not present his views in the form of arguments, set out to challenge the dualist view of the self. Kant's work is both important for Kierkegaard as well as being a body of work he seeks to challenge. For Kant, the self is both noumenal, a, quote, person that aspires to be perfectly rational, and phenomenal, an embodied but determined thing existing in a mechanistic natural world. Kant's self is a dual self-substance, possessing on the one hand the attribute of rationality, and on the other the quality of being a material substance subject to Newtonian causal laws. Kierkegaard, by contrast, as a unified picture of the self, as existent and active in the natural world, like other natural objects, although Kierkegaard's self is also, and importantly, grounded in a God that in some sense transcends this world. Kierkegaard's self, then, is an active and natural being in a process of becoming, but also immersed in a natural world that pre-exists it. This active and natural being characterizes the shared humanity of all of us. Kierkegaard's view of nature is influenced by that of Schelling. Schelling's nature is living and active. It is a nature that does not exclude freedom. Ultimately, this living and active nature is construed, for both, I have argued, in terms of metaphors of birth. Kant had given a detailed and clear account of the operation of the, quote, purposes in nature, like the ability of the tree to grow or the capacity of a human being to act from an intention. Yet Kant did not see such purposes as, quote, really existing, end quote. Rather, for Kant, we, rational finite beings, judge nature reflectively as though it were purposive. In his Freiheitsschrift, by contrast, following from his view of nature as living, Schelling writes that pantheism is not incompatible with, quote, the most lively feeling of freedom, end quote. Kierkegaard's self is embodied, and he is concerned with human intersubjective experience. This does not mean that Kierkegaard's self is solely natural, but it is important that it is not conceived purely as a mind. New section, Kierkegaard and Schelling. Schelling, in his Freiheitsschrift, makes a very large claim. Schelling writes, quote, the whole of modern European philosophy since its inception, parenthesis, through Descartes, end parenthesis, has this common deficiency that nature does not exist for it and that it lacks a living basis, end quote. Schelling. The Freiheitsschrift presents an active process ontology that, significantly, quote, precedes our thinking of it, end quote. In other words, there is being before thought. Each activity can be depicted in terms of ground and consequent, and this distinction, in turn, underpins Schelling's system. Every organic being is dependent upon another with respect to its genesis. As Ian Hamilton Grant has put it, quote, nature itself must furnish the only possible basis for a philosophy of freedom, end quote. Ian Hamilton Grant. In Schelling's process system, unlike that of Hegel, as he has been read by many, there is an irreducible remainder in nature that, quote, can never be resolved into reason, end quote. For Schelling, everything participates in a process of becoming. The ground does not reveal the ground's self as a ground until the existent has come into being. The existent is dependent upon the existence ground for the existence, quote, becoming, but not in the existence being. The mother, for example, does not become a mother until her child is born. Schelling uses the metaphor of birth, quote, man is formed in the maternal body, and only from the obscurity of that which is without understanding, parenthesis, from feeling, yearning, the sovereign, bracket, Herrlich, end bracket, mother of knowledge, end parenthesis, grow luminous thoughts, end quote. Schelling. For Schelling, therefore, humans are continuous with the rest of nature. Humans are not intrinsically different in kind from any other living being. Rather, humans are differentiated from other animals and from bacteria only by a degree. This point is very important in considering what may be universal about humanity as a whole, rather than attempting to define a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that every human from the poorest in the world to the richest in the world, from the transsexual to the heterosexual, from black to white, shares with every other. It does something different. It characterizes what humanity as a whole shares with the rest of the living natural world, and indeed ultimately with the non-living world. It is thus Darwinian in the sense that it stresses that humans have emerged from animal nature and that humans are continuous with that animal nature. Humans, therefore, share the rest of the natural world, at the very least, the conditions necessary for their reproduction, and this means the divide into two sexes, the biological female and the biological male. Kierkegaard, following Schelling, writes, quote, "Ethics begins with the actual," end quote. Human beings for Kierkegaard are, by contrast to Kant, quote, "a synthesis of the psyche and the body, but also a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. ... The self is the ... quote, synthesis of the infinite and the finite," end quote, end quote. Kierkegaard. This indeed is very close to a claim of Schelling's to the effect that, quote, "spirit is therefore neither finite nor infinite, ... but rather in it is the original unification of the finite and the infinite," end quote. Thought must be located in living reality. Those philosophers who attempt to ground reality within thought will remain caught up within thought. Human beings for Kierkegaard are natural living beings, but with the capacity both to reflect on their natures and to take up and to be guided by some moral ideal. They become certain ideas of self after the emergence of freedom. This process constitutes the self as a synthesis of soul and body. Kierkegaard is concerned throughout his works, although he is no doubt hugely influenced by Kant, to chastise Kantian ethics. Kierkegaard is, furthermore, skeptical about at least one of the Kantian notions of the self, for example in the following formulation from The Sickness unto Death, quote, "The autonomous self is like a king without a country, actually ruling over nothing," end quote. Kierkegaard. Indeed, such a self is analogous to a fully determined self, insofar as both are in despair. Perhaps he has in mind here not only the noumenal, purely rational Kantian self, but also the self as, quote, "disposition." The self is neither phenomenal nor noumenal. The wording from Sickness unto Death of the self, quote, "striving to be the self's self," end quote, suggests that it might be the latter Kierkegaard has in mind. Both Kantian notions deny the natural finitude of the self and the self's immersion in natural processes. Kierkegaard, or Half Ninus, writes in C.A., quote, "One can see how illogical the movements must be in logic. Since the negative is the evil, how unethical they must be in ethics," end quote. Kierkegaard offers a critique of the Socratic notion of, quote, sin, which is at the same time a critique of Kant, quote, "In pure ideality, where the actual individual person is not involved, the transition is necessary, after all. In the system everything takes place of necessity, or there is no difficulty at all connected with the transition from understanding to doing. This is the Greek mind, ... and the secret of modern philosophy is essentially the same. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. To think is to be, ... In the world of actuality, however, where the individual person is involved, there is this tiny little transition from having understood to doing," end quote. Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard writes further, quote, "One of the symbolic books declares the impossibility of an explanation, ... Hereditary sin is so profound and detestable that it cannot be comprehended by human understanding," end quote. He continues, apparently with Kant in view, quote, "This feeling assumes the role of an accuser, who, with an almost feminine passion, and with the fanaticism of a girl in love, is now concerned only with making sinfulness and his own participation in sinfulness more and more detestable." End quote. Kierkegaard. In quasi-Darwinian vein, new section, Kierkegaard and Schelling on process. In quasi-Darwinian vein, Kierkegaard offers a, quote, process ontology, and Kierkegaard makes a number of remarks throughout Kierkegaard's writings about how best to characterize this process. And Kierkegaard contrasts Kierkegaard's own conception of process with a conception of process that conceives of process in terms of logical mediation. Kierkegaard also, however, characterizes it differently from a notion of fracture and chaos. In the epilogue to Fear and Trembling, De Silentio, the pseudonymous author of the text, refers in a positive tone to Heraclitus. He also mentions, in a critical manner, Heraclitus' follower, Cratylus, who, quote, goes, quote, further, end quote, end quote. Kierkegaard. Cratylus, quote, went further, parenthesis, than Heraclitus, in parenthesis, and made the additional claim, in relation to the impossibility of stepping twice into the same river, that, quote, one cannot do it even once, end quote, end quote. Kierkegaard. Heraclitus offers an ontology of process, of movement. Cratylus, however, went too far in that he rendered both movement and stasis impossible and translated both into an Eleatic doctrine that denies movement altogether. In a note in his journals, Kierkegaard writes, in relation to this, quote, disciple of Heraclitus, quote, a disciple wanting to improve it said, one cannot even step into, parenthesis, the river, in parenthesis, once. Thereby the nerve is cut. As far as making any sense, the statement becomes the opposite, an Eleatic sentence, and denies motion, end quote. In a commentary on Cratylus, David Sedley writes, quote, things change so rapidly that you cannot engage with things either by naming things or stepping into things, end quote. David Sedley. In a letter written in 1847, Kierkegaard refers approvingly to Diogenes' critique of the Eleatics. He wrote, quote, if anyone denies that movement exists, I do as Diogenes did, I walk, end quote. Parenthesis, Diogenes simply walked up and down in refutation of the Eleatics' denial of the reality of motion, in parenthesis. Kierkegaard, further, in his journals, contrasts the ancient concern with, quote, actual movement with the, quote, recent, parenthesis, Hegelian, in parenthesis, concern with mediation and logic. Furthermore, Fear and Trembling is dedicated to the 18th century philosopher Hamann, the founder of the Sturm und Drang movement, who influenced Schelling and Hegel, and for whom God embodies himself in nature and history. Kierkegaard's philosophy, in this respect, prefigures that of Bergson and Deleuze, for whom, also, static beings are the result of movement, of processes of, quote, becoming. The Darwinian version of this is the process of emergence of the human race from the non-human, and, as a continuation of this, the continual evolution of the human race, the production of new and distinct types of human, as we evolve and adapt to cultural and environmental change. What remains invariant in these particular processes, however, although the forms in which they manifest themselves may vary, are the conditions that give rise to the possibility of the continuation of this vast body of humans. And these include some form of division between the sexes, as well as the conditions necessary to maintain the various individuals who themselves engage in the process of propagation of the race. This does not mean that the individual human is merely a vehicle for the propagation of the whole. Rather, it entails only that, in the vast complexity of each individual life, a life lived in relation to many others, the conditions necessary for the reproduction of the race must remain. Kierkegaard's process philosophy chimes not only with a version of Darwinian theory, but also with the work of more recent biologists who take nature, Mother Nature as she is often called, as a living system. As the contemporary biologist, Maturana and Varela have argued, life extends all the way down to the bacterium. Life as a whole, in life's turn, can be conceptualized along the lines articulated by Kant in the third critique as a, quote, system that is cause and effect of itself. Life is described by biologists Maturana and Varela as a, quote, autopoietic system, end quote. Such systems are self-organizing, self-controlling, and they do not require the inputs and outputs that are presupposed by heteronomous systems. They offer, quote, a naturalized biological account of Kant's notion of natural purpose, end quote. Every part of a natural purpose both exists for the sake of the other parts and also reciprocally produces them. A thing is a natural purpose for Kant if, quote, it is both cause and effect of itself, end quote. A tree reproduces itself over successive generations. Each generation of trees plays a role in the causal chain, being an effect of the previous one and the cause of future generations. Each individual tree in its turn produces and reproduces itself through its own growth and generation. Moreover, each part of the tree is dependent on every other part. Thus, this Kantian notion is an autopoietic system, although Kant himself, at the same time as offering an account of this process, challenges hylozoism, the view that such purposes really exist in nature. It's starting to rain, gotta go inside. A minimal notion of an autopoietic system for the above contemporary biologist is a living cell. On the view of these contemporary biologists, furthermore, cognition is a dynamic phenomenon that ought, in its turn, to be understood as an instance of autopoiesis. So the brain is such a system, with, quote, behavior that is neither random nor ordered and predictable, rather it is in between, exhibiting changing and unstable patterns, end quote. Cognition, then, is constituted by a relationship between the agent and the agent's environment. The theory, that, furthermore, allows for emergent processes that arise out of the organization of the elements of the whole. Part and whole work together. Extending this conception of system to the whole of nature, the latter can be viewed as a Gaia. Lovelock hypothesizes that the totality of living organisms, the atmosphere, the oceans, the rocks, and the soil, make up a single planetary entity that is self-regulating and self-sustaining. Organisms interact with their environment to form a self-regulating system. According to the theory, the, quote, biota, for example, the components listed above evolve together with their environment. So organisms don't merely, quote, adapt to a, quote, dead world, but rather they, quote, live with a world that is the breath and bones of their ancestors and that they are now sustaining, end quote. The whole earth is a self-regulating system made up, quote, from all of life, including the air, the oceans, and the surface rocks, not just organisms alone, end quote. Quote, Gaia is best thought of as a superorganism, end quote. Lovelock argues that the world evolved from early simple bacterial forms toward the oxygen-enriched atmosphere that supports more complex life forms. Geophysiology, which is the discipline of Gaia theory, in Lovelock's words, quote, sees the organisms of the earth evolving by Darwinian natural selection in an environment that is the product of their ancestors and not simply a consequence of the earth's geological history. Thus, the oxygen of the atmosphere is almost wholly the product of photosynthetic organisms, and without it there would be no animals or invertebrates, nor would we burn fuels, end quote. Lovelock, as noted, sees Gaia as a superorganism. Margolis, by contrast, describes Gaia as an autopoietic system like a cell. Quote, the simplest, smallest known autopoietic entity is the single cell. The largest is probably Gaia, end quote. Margolis. Critics of this notion argue that the Gaia is not a reproducing individual, and it should not therefore be accorded the status of a living entity. Thompson's suggestion, however, in response to this, is that the criticism assumes an evolutionary reproductive process. If the Gaia is construed, rather, quote, as a self-producing but non-reproducing individual, end quote, then the objection does not apply. Gaia would be a superorganism just like a cell. The cell would be among the smallest such system, and the former among the largest. Both are self-sustaining and self-regulating systems. In a response he himself gives to his critics who have made this point, Lovelock writes, quote, but something that lives a quarter of the age of the universe surely does not need to reproduce, and perhaps Gaia's natural selection takes place internally as organisms and their environment evolve in a tightly coupled union, end quote. Indeed, the earth does not produce, or not as far as we know, further earths that are autonomous from this earth. But it does make sense to suggest that the earth is self-reproducing, or that it constantly gives birth to the earth's self. Living systems, moreover, must be understood partially in terms of norms. A living cell modifies its behavior according to internal norms of its activity. A bacterium, according to this conception, partially operates in accordance with the norms that its autonomy brings about. In other words, the system is a living and dynamic system that is dependent not only on inert and external causal chains, but upon norms that govern each autopoietic system, as well as relations between systems and between systems in the whole. Overall, the metaphor of ground and consequent, deriving from Schelling, encapsulates this process. There are analogies, then, between the work of some contemporary biologists and some elements of Kierkegaard's thought. Each element of this overall organic system needs to be maintained and sustained through love. A mother, according to the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, by taking care of her infant, teaches it that life is worth living. The mother here does not have to be a female human. It simply needs to be some caring person. Okay. The natural world, then, is both an organic and living system, but also a system that requires care and love. Its various component parts, the various aspects of organic matter that it comprises, need to be cared for and loved if they are to be sustained. Love, as I and others have written elsewhere, is an important component of Kierkegaard's substantial ethic. He writes in Works of Love about the importance of loving our neighbor, which I argued includes those close to us as well as strangers. But Kierkegaard also writes about the need to love ourselves before we can love others. Quote, whoever has any knowledge of people will certainly admit that just as he has often wished to be able to will them to relinquish self-love, he has also had to wish that it were possible to teach them to love themselves. End quote. Kierkegaard. New section, the ethical dimension. When we think ethically as humans about humans, we think in terms of our responsibilities or obligations to others. If nature as a whole is a living entity, then this responsibility is extended so as to incorporate nature's various constituent parts and processes. The metaphysical model of nature gives rise, as Plato did for him, to an ethic. It is an ethic that is vital for the contemporary world. The ethical concern includes a need to care for the nature that, in Meillassoux words, quote, pre-exists the human, and I would like to add, makes the human possible. While humans frequently depend upon machines and have, indeed, been argued by many today to constitute a hybrid of human/machine, or a cyborg. Machines are not, or not yet, by themselves living things, nor machines autopoietic systems. Even the robots that appear to function on their own without a human operating them have been consciously produced by humans and programmed by a human. If they do become able to sustain themselves, perhaps to reproduce themselves and to maintain and care for their kind, then my view would be different. However, at the present time, machines, indeed, have the potential to destroy the very nature on which humans rely. Indeed, it was the very mechanization of human processes that partially enabled the most extreme horror of the 20th century, although the logic that gave rise to this extreme horror was, as several have argued, present in earlier epochs. Those who proclaim a continuity in consciousness between humans and machines may inadvertently be colluding in the logic that allows for the reduction of all living forms, including all human life, to, quote, bare life, or Zoe, Z-O-E, that can be killed but not sacrificed. Lovelock indeed has argued that, quote, R, emissions of carbon dioxide perturb the self-regulating system that is the Earth. This is not at all to say, on the other hand, that the human being, as a tool user, is not intrinsically connected to technical objects, ranging from simple agricultural objects to complex techne. The human being evolves, as in the words of Andy Clark, a, quote, extended mind, end quote. The human mind, in other words, is interconnected with body, world, and action. In important works, to summarize the details of a complex argument, Stiegler has claimed that the present phase of capitalist development, deploying the extraordinary power of digital networks that suggests the infinite recoverability of human memory, in fact leads to greater and greater degrees of powerlessness. This encompasses not only a loss of knowledge, but also a loss of the very essence of humanity, the notion of being in the world or of existing. In his book, What Makes Life Worth Living, Stiegler presents his view of the original pharmacon. The first pharmacon, Stiegler writes, is Winnicott's, quote, transitional object, end quote. The transitional object, for the very young child, quote, instills in the child the feeling that life is worth living, end quote. This notion is both positive and also potentially poisonous. The significance of the pharmacon, according to Stiegler, was first brought to our attention in contemporary philosophy, quote, with Jacques Derrida's commentary on the Phaedrus, end quote. Writing as hyponenis, hyponemneton, artificial memory, is opposed to anamnesis, or thinking for oneself. But for Plato, Stiegler argues, these two notions were separated, in fact they combined together, but in the present era of capitalist development, the potentially poisonous side of the pharmacon is able to take precedence over its positive aspect, and the mnemotechnologies that are being deployed on a massive scale are potentially able to affect desire itself. Not only producers, but also consumers find themselves disindividuated. Modern capitalism is capable of destroying desire itself. Quote, the destruction of desire, parenthesis, which is also to say of attention and care, in parenthesis, which leads to a drive-based economy, that is, an essentially destructive economy, is a new limit encountered by capitalism, this time not only as a mode of production, but also as a mode of consumption defined as a way of life. That is, biopower becomes psychopower. Biopower becomes psychopower, end quote. Stiegler. Stiegler maintains that the negative aspects of the economy must be turned to positives. The negative aspects of the notion of the pharmacon must be turned right side up again into positives. Libidinal energy must be transformed, while consumption destroys its object. Quote, libido is on the contrary what takes care of its object, end quote. Addressing the problems of contemporary capitalism, therefore, according to Stiegler, involves not simply abandoning fossil energy, but rather abandoning a drive-based economy and, quote, reconstituting libidinal energy, end quote. Energy that is focused on industrial and technological production, he suggests, must be refocused on, quote, a new social rationality. Producing motivation. Let me restart that sentence. Energy that is focused on industrial and technological production, Stiegler suggests, must be refocused on, quote, a new social rationality, producing motivation, motives for living together, that is, for taking care of the world and those who live within it, producing a new savoir-vivre, end quote.
New section. In this chapter, I have set out to argue that the metaphor of being, or the whole as a natural, quote, process system, is not only to be found in Kierkegaard's corpus, but is a plausible model in its own right. Not only, I have suggested, is it plausible as a metaphor for the whole, but it is also a model that is compatible with the kind of ethic that is vital in our contemporary world. If humanity is not to destroy both itself and the conditions that allow the human race to survive, rather than offering a set of qualities that all humans share, this chapter has presented a conception of universal human nature that sees humans as continuous with the rest of the animal and the living world. Humans are natural beings. This is not a reductive notion. Humans are not merely animals, but their animal nature is a deeply significant aspect of their being. They share with the rest of the natural world a dynamic, evolving biological nature. This nature both encompasses all of humanity and also stresses the need on the part of humanity for a shared concern for the non-human nature from which we all derive. The conception of universalism I have outlined here does indeed then lend itself to an ethic and a politics. There is a political imperative to care for the natural world on which all humans depend. This is a form of universalism about humanity that offers an alternative to the versions critiqued in the opening paragraphs of this chapter. Kierkegaard was a European whose philosophy was derided for many years by certain sections of the European philosophical establishment. Kierkegaard's work, however, challenges the forms of Eurocentrism that purport to be universalizing, but that in fact rest on a partial view of humanity. These forms of Eurocentrism rest on a partial view of humanity that stems, I am suggesting, from the implausible view of itself as a combination of a rational mind and determined body that shapes a considerable amount of the thinking in the Western tradition. Particularists and pluralists have criticized what is passed for universalism. The view I have outlined here, however, is clearly not Eurocentric or partial, nor does it offer a reductive and mechanistic view of human nature. Rather, it views all human beings as biological and natural beings. As such, we all constitute autopoietic systems that undergo change and development. We humans share these qualities with elements of the natural world from which we as humans have emerged. When postmodernists critique what is passed as universalism, they have derided it as a, quote, enlightenment conceit, end quote. While I have not accepted their critique of universalism, I do believe that there is something wrong with some versions of the, quote, enlightenment model of the human self. Unfortunately, the perceived problems with this model of the self have led to misguided and unfortunate challenges to the very notion of universalism about humanity. I have argued here that our natural natures exert causal force, in a realist fashion, over other more variable elements of the self. Our biological nature, of course, includes such qualities as the need to eat, the need for shelter, and the need to reproduce ourselves. Moreover, while there are some individual humans, both female and male, who survive without personally giving birth to other humans, the human race as a whole cannot survive without reproduction. These are biological realities, but they need not, as they have been illustrated here, be read in a reductive manner. Nor are they, as the criticism mentioned by Garris and referred to earlier implies, trivial qualities. Indeed, to the contrary, they are the bedrock set of needs that must be satisfied, as I have argued before, if humans are to be able to do anything at all. They are the bedrock set of needs, furthermore, that must be maintained if the human race is to continue to reproduce itself. In this sense, they supervene politically over the needs of fundamentalists of all colors to shape humanity in their image. This does not mean that political campaigns that concern such issues are not of overriding importance to those fighting the cause. It does not mean, to reiterate a point made earlier, that they may not feel more important or indeed be more important at the time to those waging battle against some other grouping than anything else. But the biological realities affecting all of us will ultimately shape whether or not the human race as a whole continues to maintain itself. This chapter has outlined a form of universalism and naturalism that sees the human being as a complex biological being interconnecting with the rest of the natural world. It is not necessary that I spell out precisely which properties each human possesses as a natural being, since some of these may vary from individual to individual. However, each human is made up of a biological body that is itself comprised of many processes. These characteristics are neither trivial nor are they specific only to one group of humans. Rather, they are deeply significant for all of us, and they form the basis of a continuity between humans and the rest of the natural world, on which all humans depend for our survival. And that's the end of the piece. I'm going to read here some of the endnotes. Because I didn't really, I didn't do any of the, read any of the citations while I was reading this before. So, Alison Assiter, Revisiting Universalism, published in 2003. Norman Garris, Solidarity in the Conversation of Humankind. Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. Gita Sagal's article, Knowing My Place, The Secular Tradition and Universal Values, in Sukhwant Dhaliwal and Neera Yuval Davis, Women Against Fundamentalism, Stories of Dissent and Solidarity, published with Lawrence and Wishart in 2014. A further common criticism of the human rights version of universalism is that it cannot decide between, for example, the competing rights of those who were and continue to be pro-choice, a woman's right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, for example, versus those who campaigned who were being subjected in the quote global south to reproduction controls, end quote. Oh no, it seems like there was some kind of typo there. This is pointed out, for example, by Gayatri Spivak in Spivak's article, Public Hearing on Crimes Against Women. Michael Walzer, Spheres of Justice. This claim, I don't know what claim she's referring to here, was made at a recent conference in London on October 2014, organized by Miriam Namazi and others on secularism and anti-fundamentalism. See the important work of Hans Jonas on morality as offering an alternative to most prior moral theories and suggesting that the natural world ought to be taken within the ambit of moral theory. This challenges most previous ethical theorists who have reserved the status of moral agent and patient to finite and rational beings. Elizabeth Gross, Becoming Undone, Darwinian Reflections on Life, Politics, and Art, published in 2011. See Judith Butler and Drusilla Cornell's article, The Future of Sexual Difference, an Interview. Elizabeth Gross has made some very important points in support of Igari. I don't know how to say this person's name. Irigare. On these matters in Gross's book, Becoming Undone, Darwinian Reflections on Life, Politics, and Art. This is obviously a highly controversial view to attribute to Kierkegaard. I am using the word in a particular sense and hope it will become clear that, understood in this way, it is not such a strange view to attribute to Kierkegaard. As I explain, the respects in which he may have been influenced by Schelling, the appearance of incompatibility between these viewpoints will, I hope, be resolved. See my forthcoming book, Kierkegaard, Eve, and Metaphor of Birth. See Friedrich W. J. Schelling, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom. See Ian Hamilton Grant, Philosophies of Nature After Schelling, published in 2016. I would like to thank Ian profusely again, not only for teaching me Schelling, but also for introducing me to a way of philosophizing that concerns itself with big questions, and that is not restricted to ascertaining whether or not, for example, we know that the table is brown, or other technical epistemic or linguistic concerns. Any errors in my reading of Schelling are, of course, mine. It is important to note that there are recent readings of Hegel that challenge this commonplace. See, for example, Maria J. Binetti's 2007 article, Kierkegaard's Ethical Stage in Hegel's Logical Categories, Actual Possibility, Reality, Necessity, Cosmos, and History, published in the Journal of Natural and Social Philosophy, and Catherine Malabou, The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, and Dialectic, published in 2005. This does not mean that the approach defended here shares Darwin's approach to the methodology by which this occurs, which has been criticized by some recent biologists. See Kierkegaard, The Concept of Anxiety. See Michel Koch's book, Freedom and Reason in Kant, Schelling, and Kierkegaard, published in 2006, which documents Schelling's influence on Kierkegaard. Michel Koch argues that it is true that Kierkegaard attended Schelling's lectures in 1841 to 42 to hear Schelling, and was at first very enthusiastic and then hugely disappointed. But she points to a very strong influence of the Freiheitsschrift on the concept of anxiety. I think Kierkegaard, just as a side note for people who listen to this channel, I think that those lectures that Kierkegaard attended of Schelling's might have been attended by, I'm pretty sure they were attended by Bakunin and Engels. I think one of Engels' early things was a critique of Schelling. I think, I'm not exactly sure, but I think Schelling was kind of brought in to replace Hegel after his death, and I think was kind of like pretty conservative by this point. It was kind of like trashing Hegel. I'm not exactly sure. Either trashing Hegel or making Hegel more conservative than he actually was. Moving on, see Kierkegaard, Sickness Unto Death. See Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. See H.R. Maturana and F.J. Varela, Autopoiesis and Cognition, The Realization of the Living, edited by Robert S. Cohen and Marks W. Wartofsky, and H.R. Maturana and F.J. Varela, The Tree of Knowledge, The Biological Roots of Human Understanding. See Evan Thompson, Mind and Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind. Immanuel Kant, Critique of Judgment. See James Lovelock, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. James Lovelock, A Final Warning, The Vanishing Face of Gaia, published in 2009. See the article by L. Margulis, Biologists Can't Define Life, from C. Barlow, edited From Gaia to Selfish Gene, in C. Barlow's edited volume, From Gaia to Selfish Genes, Selected Writings in Life Sciences. See Donald Winnicott, Playing and Reality. See Alison Assiter, the author of this piece, Kierkegaard, Metaphysics and Political Theory, Unfinished Selves. and the edited volume by Alison Assiter and Margarita Tonin, Kierkegaard and the Political, published in 2012. See Kierkegaard's Works of Love. See for one of the earliest and most influential statements of this position, Donna Haraway, A Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the Late 20th Century, in Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, The Reinvention of Nature. See, for example, those who defend the thesis of, quote, panpsychism. See Agamben Homo Sacer. See Andy Clark and David Chalmers' article, The Extended Mind. See Bernard Stiegler's book, The Decadence of Industrial Democracies, Disbelief and Discredit. See Bernard Stiegler's book, What Makes Life Worth Living, on Pharmacology, published in 2010. And finally, the argument of some sections of this chapter is spelled out more fully in my forthcoming book, Alison Assiter, Kierkegaard, Eve, and Metaphors of Birth, published in 2015. All right, that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.